The room went completely silent when my husband told me to know my place. There were 11 people around that dinner table. Our 3 sons, their wives, 2 grandchildren, and a few close family friends. Everyone heard him, and everyone knew he hadn't spoken to me like that before. At least, not in public. I looked at Richard across the table. He was 70 years old, retired, successful enough to be comfortable, and increasingly obsessed with proving that he was still the head of our family. I was 67. I had been retired for 3 years after spending more than 3 decades working in federal oversight and investigations. I wasn't famous, I wasn't wealthy, and I had never expected special treatment because of my career. But I had spent my entire professional life learning one thing. When someone suddenly becomes desperate to control the conversation, there's usually something they don't want examined. I just didn't know yet what Richard was hiding. That evening had started normally. Our oldest son, Daniel, was telling us about a project at work. His wife, Melissa, was laughing about something their 8-year-old daughter had said at school. Our middle son, Marcus, had brought a bottle of wine. Our youngest, Evan, arrived late because of a school board meeting. It was the kind of family dinner I'd always hoped we'd have. Then Richard put his glass down. "I've made a decision about the lake house." Daniel stopped talking. "What decision?" "We're selling it." Nobody responded for a moment. The lake house had been in our family for almost 20 years. It wasn't just property. It was where our sons had spent summers, where birthdays had been celebrated, where grandchildren had learned to swim. Marcus looked at me. "Mom, did you know about this?" I opened my mouth. Richard answered first. "Your mother doesn't need to be involved in every decision anymore." The words landed harder than he probably intended. Evan frowned. "What does that mean?" Richard leaned back. "It means I'm handling it." I looked at him carefully. "Richard, when did you decide to sell?" "Recently." "Have you spoken with the realtor?" "Yes." "And the attorney?" His jaw tightened. "Yes." Daniel put his fork down. "Dad, why didn't you tell us?" Richard's face hardened. "Because I don't need permission from my children." Nobody had asked for permission. They had asked why he had kept everyone in the dark. Then Richard turned toward me. "You've been retired for 3 years, Evelyn. Maybe it's time you stop acting like you're still running an office." I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me. Melissa looked uncomfortable. Marcus stared at his father. I simply folded my napkin. Then Richard said the sentence that changed everything. "You're my wife, not my supervisor. Learn your place." No one moved. I could have defended myself. I could have reminded him that I had never treated him like an employee. I could have listed every sacrifice I'd made for our family. Instead, I asked quietly, "Is that really what you want?" Richard smiled. "Yes." I nodded. "All right." That answer seemed to confuse him. He had expected an argument. Maybe tears, maybe anger. Instead, I picked up my purse. Daniel stood immediately. "Mom, wait. I'll see everyone Sunday." Richard laughed under his breath. "You're being dramatic." I looked at him. "No, Richard." I smiled faintly. "I'm being careful." Then I left. I drove home alone. For 28 years, I had shared that house with the man I married. I knew his habits, his moods, the way he tapped his fingers when he was nervous. And that night, sitting alone in the kitchen, I remembered something I'd noticed during the previous month. Richard had started receiving letters he wouldn't explain. He had also stopped leaving financial statements on the kitchen counter. He changed passwords on 2 joint accounts. And 3 weeks earlier, when I asked why our accountant wanted to schedule a meeting without me, Richard had said, "It's nothing." I had believed him. That was my mistake. The next morning, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into the joint financial account I still had legitimate access to. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for an explanation. What I found made my stomach tighten. There was a recent transfer, $48,700. It had gone to an account I didn't recognize. I checked the date, then the transaction history. There were 2 more. One for $19,500. Another $31,200. I stared at the screen. Richard hadn't just decided to sell the lake house. He had been moving money, and suddenly his public humiliation of me didn't feel like anger anymore. It felt like a distraction. I reached for my phone. I called the one person who had always told me never to panic before checking the facts, my former attorney. When he answered, I said only 6 words. I think my husband is hiding something. My former attorney didn't react when I told him about the transfers. That worried me more than if he had sounded shocked. Don't confront Richard yet. He said I wasn't planning to. Good. First, we verify what you're looking at. I wrote down the 3 transactions. $48,700, $19,500, $31,200. 3 transfers, nearly $100,000, and none of them had an obvious explanation. My attorney asked me to gather every financial document I could legally access, joint account statements, property records, tax documents, and anything related to the lake house. Then he said something that stayed with me. Evelyn, people usually don't hide one transaction. They hide patterns. That afternoon, I started looking, not emotionally, professionally. For 32 years, my job had required me to separate what I knew from what I merely suspected. I wasn't going to accuse my husband because I was hurt. I wanted facts. The first thing I noticed was the timing. The transfers had begun only weeks after Richard started talking about selling the lake house. Then I found something else. A payment to a consulting company I'd never heard of, $14,800. 2 weeks later, another payment, $8,600. The company had a generic name and a mailing address in another state. I called our accountant. He sounded surprised when I mentioned it. Evelyn, I thought Richard had already explained those expenses. He hasn't. There was a pause. Then you should probably speak with him. That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. He understood immediately. Okay, I'll send you the records I'm authorized to provide. That evening, I sat at my dining table with 6 months of statements spread in front of me. I made 3 columns: known, unknown, needs verification. It felt ridiculous. This wasn't a federal case. It was my marriage. But numbers didn't care about feelings. By midnight, I had found 11 transactions that concerned me. Then I found the one that made me stop breathing for a second. A payment of $72,000 had been connected to a loan. Not our mortgage. Not the lake house. A business loan. Richard had apparently guaranteed it personally. I read the paperwork twice, then a third time. The borrower was a company owned by someone named Thomas Hale. I recognized the name. Thomas was Richard's former business partner. They had supposedly ended their partnership years ago. I called Richard the next morning. He answered casually. Morning. Can I ask you something? Sure. Who is Thomas Hale? There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But I knew Richard. 2 seconds was enough. Why are you asking? I found his name in our financial records. What records? Our joint records. His voice became colder. Evelyn, you're retired now. You don't need to go digging through everything. There it was again. That word. Retired. He had started using it like an insult. I asked you a simple question. We'll discuss it later. When? I don't know. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone. For the first time in 28 years, I wondered whether I actually knew my husband. That afternoon, Daniel called. Mom? Yes? Are you okay? Why? Dad told me you were upset. I almost laughed. He told you that? Yes. What else did he tell you? Daniel hesitated. He said you're having trouble accepting that some things aren't your responsibility anymore. I closed my eyes. So that was the story. Richard wasn't simply hiding financial activity. He was preparing everyone around us to believe that I was the problem. That realization changed how I looked at everything. I didn't tell Daniel what I'd found. Not yet. Instead, I asked him, did your father mention the lake house? He said he's selling it. Did he say why? He said we can't afford to keep it. I looked at the statements in front of me. That wasn't true. At least, not according to the financial information I had. The lake house had no outstanding mortgage. It generated modest rental income during part of the year, and its estimated value had increased substantially. Selling it wasn't impossible, but it didn't make financial sense unless there was something else. That night, I searched the county property records. The ownership history appeared normal, until I opened the most recent filing. There had been a document recorded 4 months earlier. I read it once. Then again, Richard had attempted to use the lake property as collateral for a financial arrangement. Without telling me, I called my attorney. He answered immediately. Did you find something? Yes. What? I looked at the document again. I think my husband has put our lake house at risk. He was quiet. Then he said, don't tell Richard you've found it. Why? Because if I'm reading this correctly, he may not be trying to sell the property because he wants to. I felt a chill run through me. Then why? My attorney answered carefully. Because he may need the money before someone else comes looking for it. I sat there in silence, and suddenly my husband's cruel words at dinner sounded different. Learn your place. Maybe he hadn't been trying to put me in mine. Maybe he had been trying to keep me from looking too closely at his. The next morning, I met my former attorney, Martin, at his office. I brought every document I had found. He spread them across his conference table and studied them without saying a word. For almost 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of paper. Finally, he looked up. Evelyn, there are 2 separate issues here. I waited. Your husband has financial exposure you didn't know about. That's serious. And the second? He tapped the lake house documents. He may have been trying to use an asset he doesn't have the authority to control by himself. I stared at him. Explain. Martin pulled out a copy of our original property agreement. Do you remember how you and Richard purchased the lake house? Of course. Who provided the initial funds? I thought for a moment. I did. Exactly. 20 years earlier, I had received a substantial retirement-related payout from an old employer benefit and used most of it toward the purchase. Richard had contributed as well. But because we were married, I had never thought of the property as mine or his. It was ours. Martin pointed to a section I had completely forgotten. When you purchased the property, you created a family estate arrangement. I frowned. I remember signing something, but that was years ago. You signed several things. Somehow, this particular document placed certain restrictions on how the property could be transferred or pledged. I leaned closer. So Richard couldn't use it as collateral? Not without following the terms of the agreement. I felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. He had been trying to do something he couldn't simply do on his own. But I still didn't understand why. Martin, how much trouble is he actually in? He hesitated. I can't tell you the exact number yet. Estimate, he sighed. Based on what you've shown me, potentially several $100,000. I stared at him. That couldn't be right. Richard and I had always lived comfortably. We weren't extravagant. We had retirement savings, investments, property. There was no reason for us to be drowning in debt, unless the problem wasn't our lifestyle. It was someone else's. I remembered the name. Thomas Hale. Martin looked at me. You know him? I know of him. Richard's old business partner. Martin nodded. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. Thomas's company has been struggling for over a year. My stomach tightened. Richard is helping him? We need to be careful with that conclusion. I know. But the financial records suggest Richard has personally guaranteed obligations connected to Thomas's business. I sat back. Why? That is the question. Exactly. Why would a 70-year-old retiree risk hundreds of thousands of dollars for a business partner he supposedly stopped working with years ago? Then Martin opened another document. There's something else. He slid it toward me. It was a copy of an email. The sender was Richard. The recipient was Thomas. I read it, then read it again. Richard had written, Evelyn cannot know about the financing until the sale is complete. My hands went cold. I looked up. When was this sent? 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. That meant the lake house sale wasn't a recent idea. Richard had been planning it while sitting across from me at breakfast, while asking me about the grandchildren, while telling me everything was fine. I felt something inside me change. Not anger. Something quieter. Disappointment. The kind that arrives when you finally stop making excuses for someone. Martin watched me carefully. Do you want to confront him? No. Why not? Because I don't know everything yet. He nodded. That is the correct answer. I gathered the papers. Before I left, Martin stopped me. Evelyn, I turned. Whatever you do, don't move money around or make major financial decisions until we've reviewed everything. I won't. And don't threaten Richard. I wasn't planning to. He gave me a knowing look. I know you. For the first time that day, I smiled. I returned home just after 4. Richard was in the kitchen. He looked completely relaxed. Where have you been? Out? With who? An old friend. He studied me. You've been acting strange. I put my purse down. Have I? Yes. I poured myself a glass of water. Richard leaned against the counter. I've been thinking about what happened at dinner. So have I. I don't want this marriage becoming hostile. Neither do I. He nodded. Then I think you need to trust me. I looked directly at him. Trust. That word would have meant something a week earlier. Now it felt almost insulting. I've trusted you for 28 years. His expression softened, and I appreciate that. But trust isn't the same as ignoring facts. His face changed, only slightly, but I noticed. What facts? I smiled politely. Nothing yet. He stared at me. For the first time, I saw something behind his confidence. Fear. That night, I received a message from Daniel. Mom, Dad called me. He wants us all at the house Saturday morning. I typed back, why? His response came almost immediately. He says he's announcing something important about the lake house. I stared at the message. Then another one appeared. Mom, I think he's planning to sell it without telling us everything. I put my phone down. For 28 years, I had tried to keep our family together. Now I realized something. Richard wasn't afraid of losing the lake house. He was afraid of losing control. And Saturday morning, he was about to discover that control was the one thing he no longer had. Saturday morning, Richard stood at the head of our dining table like he was about to give a presentation. Our 3 sons sat across from him. Daniel had brought Melissa. Marcus came with his wife, Claire. Evan arrived alone. I sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. Richard looked around the room. I've decided to sell the lake house. Daniel immediately looked at me. I didn't react. Richard continued. The realtor has already given me an offer. Marcus frowned. Already? Yes. How much? Richard named a figure. Daniel looked surprised. That seems low. Richard's expression hardened. It's a cash offer. That doesn't answer the question. I watched my husband carefully. He wasn't nervous anymore. He thought he had regained control. Then he said the sentence that told me exactly what he was trying to do. Your mother has been making this more complicated than it needs to be. Everyone looked at me. I slowly folded my hands on the table. I haven't said anything. Richard smiled. Exactly. You've been silent because you know I'm right. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Daniel leaned forward. Dad, why are you so determined to sell this property right now? Because we don't need it. Marcus shook his head. That doesn't make sense. Richard's voice sharpened. I don't need to justify every financial decision to my children. No, Daniel replied. But Mom is your wife. Silence. Richard looked at me. You've turned them against me. I shook my head. No, Richard. Then why are they questioning me? Because you aren't answering them. His jaw tightened. I could see the frustration building. He had expected everyone to accept his explanation. He hadn't expected questions. Then Richard stood. Fine, I'll say it plainly. I'm selling the property because I need to. The room went completely still. Marcus frowned. Need to? Sus. Richard immediately corrected himself. I mean, financially, it's the responsible thing. But the damage was done. Daniel looked at me. Mom? I nodded once. Then I reached into my bag. I placed a folder on the table. Richard's face changed. What is that? Documents. About what? The lake house. He stepped toward the folder. I put my hand over it. Before anyone discusses a sale, everyone deserves to know what they're actually being asked to agree to. Richard stared at me. Evelyn, don't do this. Do what? Turn this into an investigation. I looked at him. I spent 32 years investigating things. I know, and I learned never to call something an accusation when it can be proven with documents. Daniel looked at his father. Dad, what's going on? Richard didn't answer. I opened the folder. The first page was the original property agreement. The second was the estate arrangement. The third showed the attempted financing. The fourth showed the communication with Thomas Hale. Daniel read the first page. His eyes narrowed. Dad? Richard said nothing. Marcus picked up another document. Why is Thomas's company connected to this? Richard's face went pale. Claire looked between them. What company? Nobody answered. I said quietly, Richard personally guaranteed financial obligations connected to Thomas's business. Evan looked stunned. How much? Richard finally spoke. It's complicated. Daniel laughed bitterly. No, it's actually pretty simple. He held up the document. You borrowed against the lake house. Richard snapped. I was protecting this family. I looked at him. By hiding it? I was going to fix everything. With what? He had no answer. Then I placed the email on the table. Richard stared at it. His face drained of color. Daniel read it aloud. Evelyn cannot know about the financing until the sale is complete. Nobody spoke. Richard looked at me with sigh. You went through my emails? No. Then how did you get that? It was included in the financial records. He looked trapped. For the first time in our marriage, Richard looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Marcus stood. You humiliated Mom because she asked questions? Richard's voice cracked. I was trying to save us. Daniel shook his head. You weren't saving us. He looked at me. You were risking us. Richard sat down. His hands were trembling. Then, something unexpected happened. Evan walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. You don't have to explain yourself anymore, Mom. I looked at him. He continued, We believe you. That sentence broke something inside me. Not because I needed their approval, because for years, I'd worried that if my marriage ever failed, my family would be forced to choose sides. They weren't choosing sides. They were choosing the truth. Richard looked around the table. You're all acting like I'm some criminal. I shook my head. No. I closed the folder. We're acting like adults who finally have enough information to make decisions. He stared at me. What do you want? I took a breath. I want you to stop using our family as collateral for problems you created. He looked away. And after that, you and I will decide what happens to our marriage. His eyes lifted. He knew what I meant. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't asking him to change. I was deciding what I would do. And before anyone left that table, I told them something Richard never expected to hear. I'm not taking the lake house from him. I'm taking my name out of his problems. The room stayed silent after I said it. I'm not taking the lake house from him. I'm taking my name out of his problems. Richard looked at me as if he had never really seen me before. For years, I had been the person who smoothed things over. If he made a mistake, I helped fix it. If one of our sons struggled, I stepped in. If there was tension at a family gathering, I changed the subject. I thought that was what keeping a family together meant. That morning, I finally understood the difference between supporting someone and protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Daniel was the first to speak. What happens now? I looked at Richard. That depends on what your father does next. Richard shook his head. You're making this sound worse than it is. I didn't argue. Martin, my attorney, had already explained what needed to happen. Richard couldn't simply sell the lake property and use the proceeds to cover his personal guarantees. The property had legal protections. The financing arrangements needed to be reviewed. And most importantly, I was no longer willing to sign anything simply because my husband told me it was necessary. That afternoon, Richard and I met with separate attorneys. For the first time in our marriage, we sat in the same room while two lawyers explained our financial situation to us. Richard's debts were substantial, not catastrophic, but serious enough that selling several assets would be necessary. His investment in Thomas Hale's company had failed. The promised refinancing never materialized, and Richard had personally guaranteed more than he could comfortably repay. He had been trying to sell the lake property quickly because he believed the cash would solve the problem, but it wouldn't have solved everything. It would have simply delayed the inevitable. When the meeting ended, Richard followed me into the parking lot. Evelyn. I stopped. He stood there for several seconds before speaking. I was scared. I said nothing. I thought if I told you everything, you'd lose respect for me. I looked at him. You were afraid I'd lose respect for you, so you humiliated me in front of our children? He looked down. I didn't know what else to do. That wasn't the problem, Richard. He looked up. What was? You decided that controlling me was easier than trusting me. He had no answer. 3 weeks later, Richard sold 2 investment properties. He paid down the business guarantees. The lake house remained untouched while the attorneys reviewed the estate arrangement. Eventually, we decided to sell it, but only after everything was properly documented and both of us had independent representation. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no police, no screaming match. Real life rarely works that way. There were meetings, paperwork, uncomfortable conversations, and a marriage that had quietly changed forever. Richard and I separated, not because I hated him, because I finally understood that I couldn't build a peaceful life with someone who believed my independence was a threat. He moved into a smaller condominium. I stayed in our home for several months before deciding I wanted something different. I bought a modest townhouse closer to the city. It was smaller, quieter, and completely mine. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 6 in the morning. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered. There was no tension, no waiting for someone to come through the door angry, no financial documents hidden in drawers, no wondering what I was allowed to ask. Just silence. Peaceful silence. Months later, our family gathered for Thanksgiving. Richard wasn't there, but nobody made a scene about it. Daniel brought Melissa. Marcus arrived with Claire. Evan came with his wife and their children. The house was loud again, exactly the way I liked it. At one point, Melissa came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. She leaned against the counter. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." She smiled. "I used to think you were the strongest person I'd ever met." I laughed. "That's a lot of pressure." "No, really." She looked toward the dining room. "After everything that happened, I realized something." "What?" "You didn't become strong when you confronted Richard." I waited. "You were already strong." I smiled. "I just stopped pretending I wasn't." She hugged me. Later that evening, Daniel stayed behind after everyone left. He helped me clean the kitchen. Then he said, "Mom?" "Yes?" "Do you regret not seeing this sooner?" I thought about it. 28 years, thousands of dinners, 3 sons, a lifetime of memories. No. He looked surprised. Why? Because if I spent the rest of my life regretting what I missed, I'd still be giving the past control over me. He nodded, then he smiled. "You really are still an investigator." I laughed. "Retired." He shook his head. "Not from being mom." After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen. I thought about the woman sitting at that dinner table months earlier. The woman everyone thought had been humiliated. The woman her husband had told to know her place. I realized something. He had been right about one thing. I did need to know my place, but my place was never beneath him. It was beside him until he made that impossible. And when he did, I didn't destroy him. I didn't ruin his reputation. I didn't take everything he had. I simply stopped rescuing him. That was enough. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's refusing to suffer with them anymore. And after 32 years of protecting everyone else, I finally decided it was time to protect one person I'd almost forgotten. Me.